when Jesus was crucified, he was taken to Golgotha. And when he arrived at Golgotha, things began to happen very, very quickly. The Roman soldiers kind of choreographed this all out. They knew what each person's role was in the squad that did the crucifixion. And they grabbed Jesus as they reached the site of execution. And he had the patibellum, that's the horizontal part of the cross. The patibellum was tied to his shoulders with his arms extended like this. And you'll recall at one point as he's walking, he's not able to stand up any farther. He falls. He can't catch himself. And this patibellum weighs between 75 and 100 pounds. And it lands on top of him. When they get to Golgotha, it's taken off, it's thrown on the ground. Jesus is then thrown on the ground on top of the patibellum, and he is nailed to the horizontal part of the cross. Then both Jesus and that horizontal part is picked up, and it's set in place on top of the stipes. The stipes was the vertical part of the crossbar. Now, before any of the condemned individuals reached Golgotha, that horizontal part would be set in its hole, and it would have been secured so that it wouldn't fall over with the person being crucified on top of it. It was there that Jesus would spend the last 6 hours of his earthly life with us, at least until his resurrection. Roman law required that when somebody was crucified, a sign be posted as to the reason for the crucifixion. And this was done so that any passers-by or anybody watching the crucifixion would understand what this criminal had done in order to receive crucifixion. And Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, ordered that a sign be painted in Latin, in Greek, and in Aramaic, and that it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, when the Jewish leadership saw this sign, they were angry because they did not recognize Jesus as King of the Jews. They told Pilate, change the sign. It should read, Jesus said that he was the King of the Jews. Pilate said, what I have written, I have written. He refused to change the sign. Thus, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified by the Romans for being the King of the Jews. This morning, I want to give you 6 snapshots of Jesus as King of the Jews. A snapshot's an old term we used to use and related to pictures. You take a picture and it's kind of a snapshot. And each one of these pictures I'm going to give you teaches us something a little bit different about Jesus as King of the Jews. But he's not just King of the Jews, he's also Lord of Lords. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So the first snapshot is that Jesus descended from the royal line of David. Don't do this now, but in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God has a conversation with David. And in verse 16, God says this, your house and your kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. Here, God is promising David that he's always going to have an heir on his throne. Now, what's interesting is men die, kingdoms fall. But God is promising David he's always going to have a descendant on his throne. Well, how is that possible unless that person be God? Because only God lives forever. We have seen presidents of the United States die while they've been in office. Only a few years ago, Queen Elizabeth II died while she's reigning over the United Kingdom. People die. But the one person who died and came back to life and never will ever die again is Jesus, who's the King of the Jews. Now, there's two things I want you to understand about this. First of all, that he is the son of David. Now, the Jewish line of priests had to run through Aaron, okay? But the Jews, because of that importance, kept a meticulous record of their ancestry. Anybody here fool around with Ancestry.com or any of those other websites? I've done that a little bit, okay? Well, if you were going to be a priest, you had to be able to prove your ancestry back to Aaron. The Messiah had to prove his ancestry back through David. And in both Matthew and Luke have genealogies for us. Now, this is important because guess where the genealogies in Israel were kept? Anybody? In the temple, exactly. And that was fine as long as the temple stayed in place. But in AD 70, the Romans came in, they wiped out the temple, they burned the place down to the ground, so they lost all of these genealogies. However, Jesus of Nazareth still has his genealogy in Matthew and in Luke. Now, Matthew's gospel begins in this way. An account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. All right? So we understand here at the very beginning that Jesus is a descendant of David. That was necessary to be king. All right? But Jesus was also born where? Come on, guys, wake up. Bethlehem, that's right. Okay? Micah chapter 5, verse 2 says this. Bethlehem Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah. One will come from you to rule over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity, from ancient times. Now, the Hebrew language here in this last phrase that is translated as his origin is from antiquity, from ancient times, the original Hebrew makes it very, very clear that this person born in Bethlehem who's going to rule over the people of Israel is eternal, without beginning, without end. Yeah, there in the middle, he died on the cross, but he rose again from the dead three days later, never to die a second time. Jesus is alive. And friends, when Jesus walked those hills in Judea and Galilee, who was the government in those days? The Romans, that's right. The Jews didn't have control of their own country. But they did have a king, though they didn't realize it. Their king was in their midst. Their king was Jesus. Now, the second snapshot is that Jesus was regarded as a king by various people. Now, that kind of makes sense, but think about it this way. If you're a king or a queen, but nobody recognizes you as such, what good is it? But if you're a king or a queen, since we have ladies with us today, we need to recognize that people acknowledged Jesus' kingship. Well, who were they? Well, let me give you 4 examples. The first of all are the Magi, the wise men that came from the east. And they came to worship Jesus. And you'll remember from your Christmas stories, they followed the star that eventually would stop over Jerusalem. And they went into Jerusalem not knowing where to go from there. And they were told to go to Bethlehem. And lo, the star went ahead of them. And here's what it says in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him." Now, this basically says that when they were back home in the east, wherever that might have been, could have been Iraq, could have been Iran, those are to the east of Israel today, they saw a star in the nighttime sky. And somehow God revealed to these astronomers that somebody special was being born in Israel. And they came to worship him. But they understood Jesus is King of the Jews. Second person I want to mention to you is Nathanael, one of the apostles. We don't talk about Nathanael all that much. But when Jesus began his ministry, he began by calling men and women to follow him. And one man who began to follow Jesus was Nathanael. And it says in John 1:49 that Nathanael declares of Jesus, "You are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." Somehow Nathanael recognized that. But also the crowds recognized that Jesus was king. If you look in your Bibles this afternoon, don't do it now, but in John chapter 6, Jesus performs the miracle of feeding the 5,000, which very well may have been as many as 10 to 12,000. But he did it by taking 2 fish and 5 barley loaves and multiplying them, and everybody got filled. Well, here's what John 6:14 and 15 reads. When the people saw the sign he had done, meaning the feeding, they said, "This truly is the prophet who is to come into the world." Therefore, when Jesus realized that they were about to make him a king by force, he removed himself to a mountain where he was by himself. So the crowd wanted to make Jesus their king. Well, who wouldn't want a king who can feed you every meal? And later they realized Jesus can do miracles, can raise people from the dead, can heal injuries. What better person to lead an army than somebody who can do that? Well, that wasn't Jesus' plan. That wasn't God's plan. So he withdrew from the crowds while they were planning to make him king by force. One other one, this is kind of interesting. Jason of Thessalonica acknowledged that Jesus was king, okay? Now, you may not have been thinking about Jason recently, but here's what was happening. The Apostle Paul, when he worked his way into Philippi and out of Philippi down into the rest of the peninsula of Greece, he gets to the town of Thessalonica. And there Paul continued to preach that salvation was through Jesus Christ. Well, apparently, from the text I'm going to share with you in just a moment, one of the things that Paul preached was that Jesus was King of the Jews. For here's what Acts 17:6 and 7 says. Now, this is the crowd in Thessalonica talking, but it says, "These men who have turned the world upside down," talking about the apostles, "have come here too, and Jason has welcomed them." What that indicates is that Paul and his entourage was staying in Jason's house. And they all were acting contrary to Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, Jesus. So we see here that Jason is telling the crowds that this Jesus whom Paul's preaching is some sort of a king. I should point out to us today at this point in our message that it doesn't do us any good if Jesus is somebody else's king. He needs to be our king, my king, and your king. Third snapshot I want to share with you is that Jesus entered Jerusalem as a king. Now, last Sunday was Palm Sunday. It's the Sunday where Christianity recognizes and remembers Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on what? on a little donkey, on the foal of a donkey, a baby donkey, if you will. All right? Now, it's interesting that we remember the donkey that Jesus rode, but we do not often remember why he rode it. Let me share that with you. Let me read Matthew's gospel that describes this story. And it says this: when they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives — Bethphage is a little tiny town — Jesus sent 2 disciples, telling them, "Go into the village ahead of you. At once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once." This took place so that what was spoken through the prophet, and this is Zechariah, might be fulfilled. "Tell daughter Zion, see, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did just as Jesus directed them. And they brought the donkey and the colt, and then they laid their clothes on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their clothes on the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them on the road. And then the crowd who went ahead of him and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in an uproar, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee." So that describes what happened last Sunday, 2,000 years ago. But I want you to see what Zechariah says in Zechariah 9:9. Well, I quoted it for you, or read it. It says, "Tell daughter Zion," tell the people of Israel, "see, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Zechariah, somehow writing hundreds of years before, recognized that when the Messiah entered Jerusalem, he would ride on the foal of a colt, and he would be the king of the Jews. It's sad to think about, but it's very possible that some of the people there that day shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David, Hosanna in the highest," might have been some of the people 5 days later that were shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." The fourth snapshot is that Jesus' kingship was an issue at his trial. So when Jesus was taken to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and it was the Jewish leadership doing this. You may not be aware of this, but the governor really didn't care. Pilate was not interested in religious squabbles within Judaism. In fact, he tries to tell them, "You go deal with this yourself, leave me alone." But they kept pressuring, kept pushing. And here's what John says about this encounter between Pilate and Jesus. It says, "Then Pilate went back into the headquarters, summoned Jesus, and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Are you asking this on your own? Or have others told you about me?'" In other words, do you want to be my disciple, or are you just trying to find out because somebody's told you? Pilate says, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." "You are a king then?" Pilate asked. Jesus replied, "You say that I am a king. Now, sadly, my translation of that last phrase is a poor translation. A better reading would be, "It is as you say." In other words, Jesus is saying, yes, I am a king. Therefore, Pilate orders Jesus' crucifixion because he doesn't know if Jesus might, start a rebellion against Rome. Can't have that if he's the governor. Now, I want you to see something else that's also here. In verses 36 and 37, Jesus says that he's not an earthly king, but he is a spiritual king. Verses 36, 37 read, "My kingdom is not of this world," said Jesus. "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Okay? Now, there is going to come a day, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get to that in a minute, but Jesus is going to come back. It's the same Jesus that was crucified, the same Jesus that was resurrected, the same Jesus that ascended into heaven fully alive. Ladies and gentlemen, he's coming back. And when he does, he's going to establish his rule and reign here on earth, and he will then be an earthly king over all the world. Pilate does something interesting during this dialogue with Jesus. He tries to get the crowd of that day to accept their king. Here's the way that Mark describes it. Mark chapter 15, verses 6 through 9. "At the festival," meaning Passover, "Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested. There was one named Barabbas who was a prisoner with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. The crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them what was his custom, and Pilate answered them, 'Do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you?' Hoping that they would say, 'Yeah, we'd rather have him than Barabbas.' But you know the story. They said, 'Release Barabbas, crucify Jesus.' And at that point, Pilate's hands were tied. There's nothing else that he could do. Mark 15, 13, and 14 quotes the crowds as saying, 'Crucify him.' And Pilate says, 'Why? What has he done?' And they were shouted all the more, 'Crucify him, crucify him.'" The process of crucifixion did not begin when Jesus was nailed to the cross. It began shortly after these words we've just read of Pilate saying, "Why?" He then orders that Jesus be flogged. And I will not go into a lot of detail today, but basically they stripped Jesus and tied his hands over a bench of some sort, or perhaps they tied his hands above his head, and they whipped him from his shoulders down to his calves. And when they were done with that, they turned him over and whipped his chest and the front of his legs. They beat him so severely, he almost died in that process. In fact, some people did die because of the flogging. Then they tied Jesus' arms to the patibulum and took him through the crowd. In fact, the crowd mocked Jesus. So did the soldiers, the Roman soldiers. They stripped Jesus of his regular clothes and they put on him a purple robe. Somebody took a thorn bush and tied it into a crown and set it on his head. Here's what Matthew 27 through 30 says. "Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the governor's residence and gathered the whole company around him. They stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet robe. They twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed a staff in his right hand. And they knelt before him and mocked him. 'Hail, King of the Jews!' Then they spat on him, took his staff, and kept hitting him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to crucify him. You know, it should be obvious to us, but I'll point it out in case it's not. The Romans didn't recognize Jesus as king. They merely mocked him as king. The fifth snapshot is that God exalted Jesus to his rightful place as king. The book of Hebrews begins with these words describing Jesus. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, meaning the cross, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So he became superior to the angels, just as his name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. That's Hebrews 1:1-4. The reason why I shared that that passage with you is what it says at the end of verse 3, that he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty. That is a descriptive word that is only used of kings, but it's here used of God the Father. And it says that when Jesus ascended up on high, that he came to the Father in glory, and he took his seat to the right side of the Father in glory. Most people are right-handed, and therefore the position of power is the right side. And that's where Jesus sat down, next to God the Father, who is called Majesty, who is King himself. And even though the writer does not use this phrase, the King of the Jews, in this passage, he is nevertheless painting a picture of Jesus being heralded as king by his heavenly Father. Jesus, as king, has the right to welcome whoever he wishes into his kingdom. Let's back up a few days, back to the cross. We see that this happens. It's described in Luke chapter 23, 42 and 43. And then he said, meaning the thief on the cross next to him, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's interesting, the thief dying on the cross realized Jesus was a king. And Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. And that's exactly what happened. The sixth and final snapshot that I want to share with you is that Jesus is King of Kings. From the beginning, when men began to gather together and they formed little towns, little villages, and those villages grew into cities, and they saw the needs of cities bonding together for self-defense, they began to create kings. Today we use prime ministers or presidents. And some have been good leaders, and some have been poor leaders. Some have been righteous men who created righteous laws, and some have been evil despots. But I want to conclude with two things about the King of Kings. First of all, that Jesus rules over the nations. Revelation 1, verses 4 and 5, we read, John, to the 7 churches in Asia, grace and peace to you from the one who is, who was, and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. John does not give us a time frame here, for there is no time frame for the King of Kings. He has ruled all the kingdoms in the past. He will rule all the kingdoms into the future. He rules over the nations. You have seen times when the presidents die. You've seen times when prime ministers change. But Jesus will never change. Jesus will rule forever. One thing, and then we're almost done. Jesus is king forever. In Revelation 11, verse 15, here's what we read. The seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there was a loud voice in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he will reign forever and ever." Some nations intentionally refuse to acknowledge God as God, and therefore they refuse to admit that Jesus is their king. Some nations, on the other hand, they're proud to acknowledge God as God and that Jesus is king. But I want you to see here that John says, "And he will reign forever and ever." I'm not a math person, but I understand there's two types of eternity. You and I are one type of eternity. When we began this life at our conception in our mother's womb, we began life, and we were born, and we will live into eternity. The question is where? Will you live with God forever and ever and ever? Or will you live in what the Bible calls the lake of fire forever and ever and ever? Jesus also, or the Bible also teaches us that God, being eternal, has no beginning and no end. For us, our beginning was the point of conception, but if you were able to look into the past, if somehow we were able to go as far back as was possible, we would never reach the beginning of God, for he has always reigned. And if we were able to look into the future, we would never be able to see the end when God does not reign. He will reign forever and ever and ever. The only question, my friends, is who is your king? Who is your king? God does not force his son Jesus on anybody. He freely invites you to surrender your life to him, to embrace Jesus' kingship in your own life. But he doesn't force it on us. It's a choice we individually have to make. We can make Jesus our king or say, no, we're not going to do that. The choice is yours today. Maybe you've been pursuing the almighty dollar, and that's been your king. Maybe you've been pursuing physical health. Maybe your body's been your king. Maybe you've been pursuing your career. Your career's your king. Let me tell you, friends, those things will eventually waste away. The only thing that's eternal is God. And you and I now are eternal into the future, though not into the past, but we are into the future. It's just a matter of where we're going to spend eternity. The choice is now yours. Will you give your life to Jesus today? 2 days ago, we remembered Good Friday because that's when Jesus gave his life for us. I pray that no one here today is going to have to lay down his life for Christ, but it's possible. It may happen, and I hope that you're ready to do that if you're a follower of Christ. But he does ask us to surrender our life, to turn it over to Christ, and to let Christ rule in our life. Will you do that today? Chances are a lot of you have already done that. Maybe last week, maybe a year ago, 10 years ago, 20, whatever it was. Continue to live your life to the glory of Christ.